In Curtis Yarvin's book Grey Mirror of the Nihilist Prince, he says, "Everything is about power. Everything has to have a side. Everyone knows what side they should pick. Pick it and you're a collaborator. Reject it, a dissident." But what does he mean by power? Well, to quote C.A. Bond's book, Nemesis, there is a constant structure of human orders. Human orders are invariably and unavoidably centralized, and this centralized order itself breaks down into a pattern of 3 distinct categories. He goes on to explain 3 different categories of power as mentioned. Those are the high, or the center, the middle, or the subsidiary, and the low, or the periphery. In C.A. Bond's words referring to the center, all human orders are invariably focused around this shared center of attention. As a result, this center is the most important aspect of this model, as it is the relationship of all other categories to this center, and subsequently to the other categories of this order, that infuses this model with regularity. He goes on to phrase the subsidiary, or the middle, as those power centers which are not directly in the center, but are also not entirely powerless, and the low, or the periphery, or the margin, is those groups in a society without any power, the marginalized. Now, understanding this delineation of power, let's look at how political change happens, or how change happens in general. Now, I want to keep in mind the idea of will to power, the concept that in a system with sovereignty, since sovereignty is conserved, different entities constantly vie for power. If one reduces its sovereignty, if one loses its sovereignty, then it is less powerful, and therefore it has a weaker influence on the future and a weaker influence on the world in general. And the inverse is true as well. Entities that gain or acquire power will tend to have a greater influence on the future. Their ethical character, or how popular they are in many cases, does not apply here, unless that itself, the ethical quality or the popular character, end up making them more powerful. That is to say, everything reduces down to power. Now, going back to the Juvenalian analysis, sometimes subsidiary power centers threaten to overthrow the central power. That is to say, sometimes subsidiary centers grow powerful enough in aggregate that they begin to approach the power of the center and threaten to become the center themselves, to dethrone the current center. To quote C.A. Bond, "At times it is this power which aligns with the periphery as a means to strengthen itself and weaken the subsidiary power centers. At other times it is the subsidiary power centers which engage with the periphery to undermine and overtake the primary power." Now, sometimes, keeping in mind that will to power, subsidiary power centers begin to grow in aggregate perhaps more powerful than the central power. They begin to approach the power that the central authority has, and in this circumstance, they need to fight with one another and compete. And sometimes the thing that tips the balance here is appealing to the low, the periphery, those with very little power. Sometimes that is enough to ensure that the subsidiary will not overtake the center, or that the center will be dethroned by the subsidiary, in the case of the middle appealing to the low. To quote C.A. Bond, "At times it is this central power which aligns with the periphery as a means to strengthen itself and weaken the subsidiary power centers. At other times, it is the subsidiary power centers which engage with the periphery to undermine and overtake the primary power." To give an example from history, take Henry III, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. At this time, the papacy are a convincing and strong middle authority. They are a convincing and strong subsidiary power center. However, Henry III, wanting to displace them in fear that the papacy might overtake the Holy Roman Empire as the primary authority, begins to appeal to German bishops who have theological disagreements with the papacy, and in doing so, make them amenable to the Holy Roman Empire's side against the papacy. This brings him a decent amount of power, and he almost does overthrow the papacy until the papacy change their position on those theological subjects, and the Holy Roman Empire is, in some ways, overthrown. This is a very clear example of this high-low versus middle. The high, the Holy Roman Empire, recruits the low in terms of power, German bishops, to help push the power balance and allow the middle, the papacy, to become too weak to be viable as a force that would overpower the central authority. This means, in some sense, there is no such thing as a grassroots movement. Only movements that successfully court power, or movements that are genuinely believed in by the powerful and started by the powerful. That is to say, People without power cannot enact political change. That's a fundamental assumption here. Political change is a consequence of power being applied to desire. Will plus power allow political change to be affected in whatever sphere you're looking at. And in those cases where the marginalized or peripheral want to have political power or want to affect political change, the only real way to do that is to derive power from either the subsidiary or central power. That is to say, the central or subsidiary must become a patron of the marginalized or peripheral to endow the marginalized with enough power to affect political change. To borrow terminology from economic literature, there's something called perfect competition when it comes to political organizations. Perfect competition is the opposite of monopoly. It's the circumstance where there are so many, essentially undifferentiated firms in a certain market that competition reaches its peak and equilibrium is reached essentially immediately. Supply and demand approximate perfectly into equilibrium in this circumstance. And that is essentially the case with political organizations. There are so many that appeal to every single sort of desire, that the only case where one can become powerful is by courting one of the more powerful groups, the subsidiary or the center. This is because by default, all of these political organizations are powerless. They have to have power embedded in them to enact political change. To quote C.A. Bond again, without the assistance of a center of power, any action by the periphery is, by virtue of lacking institutional embodiment and political protection, at best sporadic and ineffective. A popular protest, rebellion, or any other form of dissenting action by the periphery, if it has no support from an element in the power structure, will quickly fade into irrelevance. If it does have this support, it will find itself supplied with resources, exposure, protection, and institutional embodiment. So I want you to keep in mind those two circumstances. On the one hand, if you have no backing by those who are in power, you will be sporadic and ineffective. And if you do have backing, then you will have resources, exposure, protection, and institutional embodiment. That is to say, if you can find circumstances of a certain political organization supplied with resources, exposure, protection, and institutional embodiment, you know for certain that either that group is powerful or that they are being courted by powerful groups and therefore appeal to the goals, the political goals of powerful groups. Now, I'm sure you see where I'm going with this, but let's look at the corollaries with Antifa and Black Lives Matter. Now, can we see these groups being supplied with resources? Yes, we can. The Open Societies Foundation, George Soros's, has sunk $220 million into Black Lives Matter. Amazon has sunk $100 million. Google has sunk $12 million and now has a black-owned businesses promotional system. United Health, a for-profit healthcare company, sunk $10 million into them. That is definitely resources. That is monetary sort of resource, which is probably the most direct that could be supplied. Now let's look at exposure. To see if Black Lives Matter have been afforded exposure, there are a couple ways we could do that. We could compare it with another political organization that has gone through a similar event as Black Lives Matter but been covered differently. Or we could even look at previous circumstances that appeal to Black Lives Matter that, despite being exactly the same as another circumstance, were reported on very differently, and we can do exactly both of these. In the latter case, we can look at the political traction brought on by the Trayvon Martin incident and the George Floyd incident and see if they are equal, because the events were equal, and therefore, unless political tastemakers are changing the news atmosphere, they should be reported on equally. To compare George Floyd to Trayvon Martin, there were only 174,000 news pages indexed with the term Trayvon Martin on Google News. That is to say, George Floyd, in terms of news articles published, received 159 times the traction that Trayvon Martin did, indicating that at one point news tastemakers changed their framing of the same event. This is very interesting because it implies that exposure was shifted over the course of 2011 to 2020 with regard to Black Lives Matter. So far, we can show that they have resources and exposure. Now let's analyze the third criterion for if a peripheral organization has institutional support, has support from power centers. The third criterion being if they have protection, presumably institutional protection. And while this is difficult to, analyze precisely, let's look at the difference between the search results of Google, a search engine which will modify then promote separately different websites, different news articles, different content depending on the internal views of the company, and Luke Smith's Search Index, which is a multi-search engine aggregate network. The first result on Google, if you search Jared Taylor being an American white advocate and the founder of American Renaissance, the first result is the SPLC. In fact, the first two results are the SPLC. The fourth result is Vox.com. The seventh result is an ABC News hit piece. The eighth result is a Guardian article. And only the ninth result is his official website, amren.com. Now let's check Luke Smith's Search Index, which cannot be censored and cannot be artificially promoted because it is an aggregate search engine of multiple sources. Now, the first result is his website, amren.com, then Wikipedia, then Amren's Jared Taylor section, then his book, then a Goodreads article for him, then corollary writings by an author named Samuel Francis, and only then is the SPLC article. Now, perhaps one would argue that Google is not censoring it, it just happens to be that search is randomly different. If that's the case, let's look at the result for Black Lives Matter. Well, on Google, the first result is blacklivesmatter.com. On search, the first result is blacklivesmatter.com. On Google, the second result is Wikipedia, as it is on search. Now, on Google, the third result is a New York Times article. On search, the third result is a book, which is, somewhat a degree of news promotion in Google, but you see what I mean. They are virtually exactly the same between those two sources. The only censorship is for those people who oppose the Black Lives Matter organization. People like American Renaissance's founder, Jared Taylor. Now, to show the final and fourth section that defines if a peripheral organization has support from a power center, either in the center itself or the subsidiary, let's read the Guardian article, Real Change or Symbolism, What Silicon Valley is and is not doing to support Black Lives Matter. Now, partially, this is a scaremongering article to show that no matter what happens, it'll never be enough, but let's look at the institutional embodiment of Black Lives Matter. Facebook, who donated $200 million, stated publicly through their CEO that they stand with the black community. They also launched a section called Lift Black Voices, where users can watch videos from black activists and entertainers. That is known as institutional embodiment. Let's see about Twitter, one of the various news sources that is not a news organization. The Guardian says the official Twitter account changed its avatar from a blue to a blackbird and changed its bio to Black Lives Matter, as did nearly a dozen other company accounts. Off the platform, Twitter posted tweets from black users on billboards across 8 US cities. Interesting. That seems a lot like institutional embodiment, keeping in mind their CEO pledged $1 billion in donations to the organization. Very interesting. Let's see about Snapchat. The CEO acknowledged that he is privileged as a white tech executive because he's white, not because he's a tech executive. And then they said that they would bar Trump's posts from appearing in their Discover channel, keeping in mind Snapchat, as a company that makes money, is a news source. Let's look at Google, one of the richest and definitely the most influential platform that exists in Silicon Valley as of present, who are primarily, keep in mind, an advertising agency. The Guardian says Google celebrated Juneteenth with a Google Doodle. It also programmed its AI assistant to answer the question, do all lives matter, by responding, Black Lives Matter. Very interesting. This is known as institutional embodiment. Google committed to improving leadership representation of underrepresented groups by 30% over the course of the next 5 years. Google's workforce is 51% white and 3% black, which, by the way, means that both groups are underrepresented there. Now let's look at what Reddit did, Reddit being effectively another news source. Their CEO, Steve Huffman, posted a message in solidarity, and the site's co-founder, Alexis Ohanian, resigned from the company's board and urged Reddit to replace him with a black candidate. This is, in the most formal terms possible, institutional embodiment. I could go on with this. I could go through Amazon, I could go through Airbnb, I could go through Twitch, I could go through YouTube, but for now, let it be said that, at least within Silicon Valley, there's very strong institutional embodiment. And within the government, by way of their 501c3 status, they are also given institutional embodiment and protection. This is very interesting because it shows this organization fits all 4 of the categories of an organization that has support of a power center, of the central or medial authority. Now, Perhaps a leftist in response to this would say that perhaps they do have that institutional backing, perhaps they are propelled by power, but it's not the central power, it's just the medial power. It's just the subsidiary power that's courting them, and that they're overthrowing the real power center, which would presumably be racist in their view. Now, there are 2 points that make this seem decently impossible, and one of them is that we know who funds Antifa and we know who funds Black Lives Matter. It's the Open Societies Foundation, a $35 billion political organization run by George Soros. It's Amazon, the largest e-commerce site on the planet. It's Google, the largest online ad agency as of present. And it's United Health, the largest of the for-profit healthcare companies that they compete against. None of these can really be argued to be a subsidiary power. Who is the Open Societies Foundation subsidiary to? Who is Amazon, Google, or United Health? Who are they subservient to? Who do they serve? They're not subsidiary. These are all central powers within the spheres in which they operate. Now that's one point. The point of, we know who funds them, and they are not subsidiary. But another point to show that they're being courted by the primary power center and not anything medial is another quote from C.A. Bond, which is, "To the periphery, the subsidiaries are the immediate manifestations of irksome authority that burden it with what it sees as petty tyrannies. They are therefore both in alignment against the subsidiaries for different reasons, but in alignment nonetheless. And this is why, in conflict between the central power and the subsidiaries, the periphery generally aligns with the central power." That is to say, it would not make sense for Antifa or Black Lives Matter to be courted by a subsidiary medial power source, because then Antifa would be pushing that medial power source out. It generally hurts a subsidiary authority to appeal to the lower and to propel the lower, because the lower can be propelled in no direction other than into the middle. That would harm the middle. And this is partly very, very visible. Why are they so insistent on demonizing the suburb? Why are they so insistent on demonizing what the suburb symbolizes, which is the white American middle class? Well, it's because the middle, constituted by those sorts that would live in a suburb, are the thing hindering, are the, what C.A. Bond calls, immediate manifestations of irksome authority. That's why they do not like them. They are not symbols of the highest power in America. The central power of America is not represented by people that live in suburbs. It's represented by people who live in Manhattan and people who live in Palo Alto. But the reason that the suburbs are demonized by Black Lives Matter is not only because they're a symbol of whiteness, but also because they're a symbol of the irksome authority that burden them with what they see as petty tyrannies. It's the immediate manifestation of that irksome authority. They do not immediately see the center and the power that they have. Perhaps, and I believe this is true, Antifa and Black Lives Matter are deluded to the point of thinking that Google, of thinking that the Open Societies Foundation who fund them are in fact not powerful, that they are part of the popular movement. It is very possible, in my mind, that these people really do believe Google, Amazon, the Open Societies Foundation, Twitter, United Health, are part of the resistance. Resisting against whom? Well, to them, the suburb, the white middle class, the middle of America. And in Juvenel's terms, the subsidiary power center. These people who live in suburbs are the sort of people who will own small businesses, something that constitutes the middle. The suburb is the symbol of medial power, power that may grow into something bigger, but the suburb per se will only ever be subsidiary power, the thing immediately visible to Black Lives Matter and Antifa that they demonize because it's immediately visible. They don't care to look at the power that the Open Societies Foundation holds. They don't care to look at the power that Amazon, Google, or Twitter hold. They care about what's immediately obvious and what's immediately pragmatic for them. Because, as I said before, there is perfect competition when it comes to these political organizations. There would be no reason for the high center of power to fund somebody who recognizes the high center of power. That would harm them. They have the choice to fund whoever they please, and they choose to fund the people who ignore those with real power, the center. And while that's all very interesting, and while it's in some sense anemic to identify the sort of people who fund Antifa and BLM and the political power that they manifest, let's return to the title of this video, which is a little more pithy. Antifa, the Janissaries of the New Emperor. What does this mean? Well, let me quote C.A. Bond again. He says, referring to the infantry that fight for monarchies in the Middle Ages, infantry did not become capable of withstanding cavalry charges until the Swiss had revived a certain Greek tactical formation, and it was only then that, backed by plebeian mercenaries, the monarchy could make itself absolute. Juvenal explains the reasoning behind this development by the vivid example of the Janissaries of the Ottoman Empire, a force comprised of Christian slaves from the Balkans who were the core of the Sultan's fighting force, not, as would be expected, the Islamic nobility. This pattern of the periphery being conscripted into forces directly answerable to the central power is repeated throughout history. The monarchies, now able to provision their own forces that were loyal directly to them, and also reliant on them alone, could now act without the hindrance of the nobility. There is only one difference between the Janissaries and Antifa, that being that the Janissaries were an involuntary force and were selected through different means, but the fundamental similarity, the similarity qua power structures, remains, and it remains very strongly. There is a certain monarchy, there's a certain center of power that recruits people not directly below them, but all the way below them, that recruits people without any institutional power, that in one sense makes them reliant on the center, as is the case for Antifa and BLM, and on the other hand does not allow the middle to gradually overthrow the top, that provides an immediate enemy for the very bottom, the immediate enemy being the immediate manifestation of that irksome authority that we mentioned before. Just like the Janissaries embody the central authority and central power of the Sultan by fighting for him, Antifa and Black Lives Matter embody the central authority of the nation that we live in, of the broader cultural context that we live in. The people who fund and propel these organizations are the centers of power in this nation and cultural continuum. They are the high authority. They are not the subsidiaries, and they're certainly not the low. There is really, as mentioned before, no such thing as a grassroots movement, and no such thing as a people's organization. All political change comes down to political power, but that is a very important analogy to keep in mind. When you see groups of Antifa or BLM supporters protesting against suburban people, against white people, against people who make $65,000 a year, remember that what they're doing is the same as what the Christian Janissaries were doing, helping the real central authority, noting the minor dissimilarity that the Janissaries were forced, but helping the central authority by attacking the middle, attacking the immediate opponents of the central authority that wants to propagate and maintain itself. Anyway, that's going to be all for me. Reach me on Urban at Narmalhochtel, as always. Cheers, and I'll be out with another video tomorrow, as per the usual.